Who will the Dallas Cowboys hire to replace Dan Quinn? We discuss the top 3 candidates on this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Cowboys. Locked On Cowboys.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can check him out on Twitter at McCoolBCB. And Landon, the Dallas Cowboys are going to have a new defensive coordinator. We knew that. Dan Quinn moving on to the Washington Commanders. We thought there was a really good chance that Joe Witt was going to be the next defensive coordinator of the Cowboys. That's not happening either. He's agreed to be Washington's defensive coordinator. So the Cowboys are looking for someone to run their defense. We've heard some veteran coaches out there. We're going to run through the top 3 candidates. And let's start with Mike Zimmer, who is interviewing today for that job.
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about Zimmer, and frankly, Zimmer should be, a familiar name for Cowboys fans. I mean, obviously, he spent a very long time with Dallas, mostly during the Parcells era, as a defensive backs coach and a defensive coordinator, and lots of other aspects of the defensive backfield area. And has been a stalwart for almost 8 years at the Minnesota Vikings as their head coach up until 2021. He's famous for having a kind of these unique defenses that kind of use different tools to kind of expose weaknesses in offense. He was obviously very famous for this kind of mug defense where he would attack the AA gaps, and then as the years kind of went on, he developed sort of more of a Saban philosophy on the back end. A lot more cover 7 man match stuff. On the outside. So he's definitely known for being I don't know what the proper term for this, but a hard coach, someone who coaches folks hard. And can be tough on his players, much like Bill Parcells was, right? He kind of comes from that sort of old school mentality. But it's interesting. He's extremely kind of old school in a lot of ways, but since football is extremely cyclical, a lot of his old school thought processes and methodologies are kind of coming more into coming back around into style. So I think, there is a lot to like about Mike Zimmer, the defensive coordinator, that doesn't necessarily speak to Mike Zimmer, the head coach, which I think is some of the issues that he had that left him, that made him leave Minnesota. He is one of these guys that I am interested to see what he can do as in a purely defensive coordinator role where he's only having to deal with that side of the ball and not kind of the larger issues of being a head coach.
So I asked somebody who knows the Vikings really well, who's like an ex-NOS guy over there. What does he think about Zimmer as just a defensive coordinator? Like, can you give me one word to sum him up? And he said he's a chameleon. He will change and he will tinker and he'll adapt his scheme every single year, kind of based on some trends. He isn't just, hey, this is my scheme and this is how I run it. He very much is, hey, what's the trend of the NFL? Okay, let's see how we can use our players to put them in the best position to make plays. You described him as a hard coach. There's a lot of ways I wish I could describe it, but I can't say him on a podcast.
That's my problem too.
Right.
Yeah.
I do think the year off, or actually it would be 2 years off for him now, I bet have done him some favors, because just knowing Mike Zimmer a little bit, that he went back into his office and was researching and coming up with new ways to stop offenses. I don't want to give away who I like the best of these three guys, but I would be very excited about Mike Zimmer back with the Cowboys as a defensive coordinator. I just think especially for this team, Landon, like Mike McCarthy is going into the last year of his deal. If this was a new coach, a young coach, maybe I would want somebody who's a little bit younger that you could kind of start to develop. But if we're just trying to do this thing for a year, who better than Mike Zimmer to come in and help you try to win some games?
Yeah, it's funny. You reached out to some folks. I reached out to Cody Alexander, who you guys may know is a coach that has written a couple of really great books. And if you get a chance, you should definitely check them out. And I just said, hey, I just wanted a quick opinion from him about what he thought about a potential of a Zimmer defensive coordinatorship for Dallas. And he said that he thinks he would be more aggressive than Dan Quinn. Defense, he says defense wasn't really an issue when he was in Minnesota. Always had very good secondaries. Will not run as much dime and nickel, which I think that part is kind of the real big thing, is that it'll be a major shift away from kind of the dime and nickel all the time sort of looks the Cowboys have been doing to something a little bit more traditional. So that will be interesting to see. And I do want to add in one last thing, is that I think one thing that does interest me about Zimmer and about kind of what he's been doing is that he did consult for Deion Sanders at Jackson State. I think he did a little bit of work for them in Colorado as well. And so I do like the idea that he's had to kind of keep up with what's been going on in college football and keeping up with kind of the newer trends and how to attack those. So I think those are all very positive reactions to what happened at the end of his Minnesota career, getting some, development of his craft in college to see what the next trends are.
Yeah, a couple other things that I want to mention. I think for the current talent that the Cowboys have on their roster, Zimmer just makes a lot of sense. Like, he's going to know how to use DeMarcus Lawrence. Like, Trayvon Diggs would be an unbelievable corner in his scheme, and so would Deron Bland. I think both those guys fit in really well. I think Donovan Wilson could have like a career year as that box safety who's doing a lot of blitzing. I think they would find ways to use Micah Parsons. We saw Daniil Hunter developed really well with Mike Zimmer. Anthony Barr, which, I mean, Parsons is a far, far better player than Anthony Barr. They did a lot of cool things with Anthony Barr as well, lining him up over the center and blitzing him off, just finding interesting ways to let him make an impact. I talked to, I'm trying to see how to describe this guy, a very prominent X and O person in the NFL. And they said if the Cowboys hire Zimmer, they will upgrade their defensive coordinator. Now, that's just one person's opinion, but there are a lot of people out there that really believe that Zimmer, especially with all of the Shanahan trees and all the Shanahan coaches, would be an upgrade. And I don't know if you saw the graphic that's Cowboys Stats and Graphics, Daniel Houston posted, finally posting graphics once again. Zimmer's EPA against the Shanahan tree is like the second best in the NFL over the last 7 years. And we've been talking about this for a while. Like, if the Cowboys are going to make a run in the NFC, they're going to have to get past Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, Matt LaFleur. Why not go out and get the guy that's been the best at stopping them?
Well, I mean, this is the guy that was around when Shanahan's dad was around running his offenses originally. So he probably has some of the secret sauce to stop it, even in its kind of advanced form. So, we will talk about our most interesting candidates, but I definitely think he is one that is very interesting, to be say the least.
Do you think Zimmer could talk Terrence Newman out to come giving us like 15, 20 snaps a game? Newman followed Zimmer to Cincinnati and then back to Minnesota.
I have no doubt that Newman could still give you 15 or 20 snaps. I know that for sure. Yeah. I mean, he could still come out and run, I bet.
All right. Let's talk about some other candidates that the Cowboys are interviewing this week, starting with Wink Martindale of the New York Giants. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by DoorDash. Did the game go to timeout? Time to order in with DoorDash. Is it halftime? That is ordering in time. 2-minute warning. You got it. That is your cue to order in. Whenever the game clock stops, it's time to order with DoorDash. Order chips, dips, nachos, or whatever you need. Pizza, wings, burgers, or even just buns on DoorDash, and get it all delivered without missing the game. Get prepared before game day. Stock up on your favorite appetizers and order all of your tailgate gear on DoorDash. Then get ready to watch your team win. Get 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and enter promo code LOCK23. Subject to change, terms apply. Again, that is 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and enter promo code LOCK23. Subject to change, terms apply. This episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. It's what brings home the winning trophy. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with the eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride the first time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. All right, Lana, let's talk about Wink Martindale, who the Giants, they said, mutually agreed to move on from this offseason. That's back-to-back years that we've seen Wink Martindale get kind of moved off of. What are your thoughts on the Cowboys bringing him in?
I actually think you and I had discussed, Wink and how just vastly different his scheme, just on the outset looks than Quinn's does, right? It's a lot more focus on pressure and manufactured pressure, blitzing, sometimes high risk blitzing. I'm going to talk about two things, and I'm going to talk about them separately because I think that they are kind of separate. Let's talk about Wink, the defensive coordinator and the candidate overall, and then how he fits or doesn't necessarily with the Cowboys, right? I think Wink has kind of gotten a bad rap a little bit. I think he made a bad decision, career choice. I mean, maybe he didn't have a lot of the choices, but he went to New York when, I think that maybe they looked a little bit more of an appetizing team. Mm-hmm. And I think personnel really handcuffed Wink as the last few years have kind of gone on. I think he did finally get a guy in Ojulari, and a guy in Thibodeau that could kind of rush the passer a little bit, but it came late in his career, and Thibodeau isn't exactly quite where they want him to be yet, and I think developed as an elite pass rusher. And I think that, I will say this, I have a hard time remembering a defensive coordinator that's had worse luck with injuries in their defensive backfield, right? Think about all the injuries that the Giants have suffered in that backfield, and then that last year in Baltimore, if I'm not mistaken, he lost both Marcus
Peters and Marlon Humphreys.
And Marlon Humphreys by the end of that year.
And he didn't have Roquan either, so it's not like they had awesome linebacker play either.
So, he has, I do think that, he has drawn up some really incredible stuff. You've seen it throughout the years. He's been able to make things happen with lesser talent at times, but I think overall, because he hasn't had kind of elite talent in a while, it's kind of taken a toll on his, defense's rankings and that sort of thing. So this is all a very long-winded way of saying I like the idea of Wink Martindale as a defensive coordinator, as an X's and O's guy, as a more stable Rob Ryan. I would say, I think is he's kind of the Ryan tree, but I feel like maybe a little bit, kind of more sound, not quite as not that they're not sound, but they're crazy, man. They'll blitz from anywhere and anytime for no reason. Having said all that, right? I think the problem I have with Wink is the fit with the Cowboys, right? Because here's the thing. there are two big things here that are at play, right? The Cowboys clearly, and I think that this is something that we didn't really mention specifically, but what has been mentioned by some of the beat writers is that it sounds like the Cowboys are interested in hiring a defensive coordinator that has some head coaching background, right? And that I imagine that has to do with the fact that if they wanted to get rid of Mike McCarthy midseason or something like that, they wanted somebody steady who could put their hand on the ship that has experience, that they wouldn't have to scramble to find a temporary head coach, right?
Sure.
Wink Martindale doesn't have that. So he's an extremely experienced defensive coordinator, but he has not had any head coaching experience. And then the other thing I think that is the kind of big strike against him, just as far as his fit with the Cowboys, is kind of what we've discussed earlier. It's such a change from what they previously had. And I think that this is a concern with these other folks too, Zimmer and Rivera. I just think it's more severe with Martindale that it's going to take, I would say, multiple seasons to get this group up to speed with the Martindale defense. And I don't know that this team wants to commit to a multiple season situation with the defensive coordinator.
They can't.
Yeah. So I think that that's really my biggest. I have other issues, and I don't know that he necessarily is the best choice of defensive coordinator just in a vacuum anyways. But even if he was, I do think that those two things that we mentioned are pretty serious roadblocks for his candidacy as the Dallas Cowboys defensive coordinator.
I also have some concerns about his personality. There was a report that came out, was it right at the end of the year, about him and Brian Daboll just not getting along, right? And I do wonder, like, how would he mesh with Mike McCarthy? How would he mesh with the players on the team? I will say one of the things that makes Wink such an attractive defensive coordinator is that generally his teams have been pretty good at stopping the run. He gets those guys to play the run really well. I was watching a clinic video of him the other day talking about how rushing the passer is something that it's a privilege, not a right. Like, we've got to stop the run first. And everything that on their defense is built about trying to get to third down rather than, hey, let's stop the run under the way of the quarterback. Like, his run fits are just so much better than even Dan Quinn, who obviously had some issues with that before. So I can see why there's some appeal there. But if there was like a sliding scale of like how aggressive you want to be, your defensive coordinator to be, he would be at 100. Right? Like there's not a defensive coordinator that is more aggressive than Wink Martindale. And I don't know if that's always what Dallas is needing. I don't think more aggressiveness is what Dallas's issue was last year, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is a point of diminishing returns, right? And I think you look at what Dak was able to do against these defenses, and if you face a quarterback like Dak who's cerebral, has all the answers, knows where his hots are, and doesn't panic in the face of a blitz, Martindale's stuff his fastball can get blasted over the left field wall, so you have to be careful there. Yeah. You wonder how much and how more successful the blitz, would work with better personnel, and maybe he doesn't blitz as much with better personnel and better pass rushers, right?
And that's the hope, right? Like, I still think he's aggressive, but he's not sending 8 on a 2nd and 9, because
he doesn't need to, right? He may not need to as much, right? Maybe that's the case, but yeah, he's an interesting dude. He's definitely, I would say, of these three, he's the most unique, right? He's the most swinging the other way than what I would imagine Ron Rivera and Mike Zimmer do.
And I was like comparing him to like Brandon Staley, who we've not heard that the Cowboys have any interest in, by the way. But like Brandon Staley is the opposite. Like, he just doesn't want to ever blitz. Wink Martindale wants to blitz you on every single play, regardless of the situation. I do think it can work if you have the right corners, and maybe the Cowboys do have the right corners. If Diggs comes back 100% healthy, Deron Bland keeps it up. Maybe you bring back Gilmore, you bring back Jordan Lewis. Maybe you do have the corners to run this defense instead of, who was it, Cordero Flott, who we were talking about last year, like having to cover CeeDee Lamb one-on-one. If you have the corners and you could play that style of defense, it's really, really hard. But I'm going to keep coming back to the Shanahan trios. I don't know if Wink is the guy to stop a Kyle Shanahan, a Sean McVay, a Matt LaFleur. It just doesn't seem like his defense is built for that.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it's probably very easily exposed by, like I said, cerebral quarterbacks or quarterbacks being puppeted by Kyle Shanahan.
Exactly. Because those are definitely two different things, without a doubt.
Well,
Uh,
probably the same result at the end of
yeah.
the day, right? Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about Ron Rivera, who has been mentioned in rumor for this job for weeks now. Let's discuss what the Cowboys defense would look like with him in charge next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Happy Super Bowl to all who celebrate from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're like me, Super Bowl Sunday is all about scoring the best seat on the couch and grabbing your favorite football snacks, boneless wings, and placing some super bets. I have already started to place some bets this week. I went to FanDuel this morning. I bet on will there be a successful 2-point conversion. It's always fun. We see these teams be really aggressive in the Super Bowl. So that's one of my favorites right now. There's also so many other different ways to bet on the Super Bowl. You can bet on who's going to score the first touchdown, how many points will be scored, and so much more. New customers, if you join today, you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, Lana, let's talk about Ron Rivera. We've spent a lot of time talking about what his defense would look like, but could you give us a quick, pros and cons to Ron Rivera?
Well, I think the pros and cons, the biggest pro to me is that I think of these three, that the learning curve for kind of getting into what a Ron Rivera defense would look like would be probably the slightest, right? I think that you could run a very similar kind of hybrid defense of Ron Rivera and Quinn, and I think you would probably you would lessen the kind of necessary learning curve of dealing with changing of the calls and a lot of the other things in a very similar manner. Now, I do think that Rivera may, play less nickel, play less dime than Quinn did, because obviously that's really where Quinn was starting to lean in at the end of his tenure here. I think you will see kind of more of an emphasis on the linebackers with Ron Rivera. I mean, just because Rivera was a linebacker guy. Mm-hmm. So I do think that there will be a little bit more of that. I would imagine that you would see less of the NASCAR package than you had previously, though I do think that on third downs he wouldn't be afraid to deploy that. But I wouldn't think that. I think that you're going to see more big bodies on the defensive line. I think that would be a big thing as well.
Well, Dan Quinn's not going to use all those big bodies over there. I wonder if we can trade for like Deron Payne or Jonathan Allen.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, he doesn't get to carry any of those guys just with him out of the Washington facility and bring them over to Dallas if he signs. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that the kind of emphasis on the talent up front across the defensive line and not just the ends, that would be something that would kind of change with Rivera. I think Rivera is very clean. I think it's just it's nothing to get excited about, to be honest. But I think
right, yep. You make contact with the ball.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's a solid, on base hit, right? Like so I think Rivera is a good fallback if you're not going to accept. Look, I mean, let me be clear again, just to reiterate, my personal preference was for them to find a way to get Witt back, or to find a kind of way to continue the continuity.
Which, by the way, just really quickly, why did we think Witt left? Because he was talking even earlier this year about how his dream job was to be the Cowboys defensive coordinator. What I've got my thoughts, but I want to hear yours.
I think he probably knows more than what we know, right? Like that he probably wasn't going to get that job, that the Cowboys were probably interested in hiring. Let's get Ron Rivera, and then we can talk about who. There's a very clear dark front runner in this list, and we'll talk about it. But I have to imagine that just to kind of finish, Witt probably got word that there's a very clear front runner and that he wasn't it. And Witt isn't like Rivera and Martindale, where he's a known quantity, right? Like it's basically the Cowboys and Washington that probably wants him. So he probably went with the known quantity, right? He knows he has that job. And so he took the job while he still had it available to him. And I think that, it makes some career sense. He probably had to risk your dream job in order to get job security. But back to Rivera, I do think that he's probably the guy that, even though you're hiring someone outside the building, he fits the mold of wanting somebody outside the building, wanting somebody that has some head coaching experience, but would be the the candidate that's the closest to an internal hire in the sense that I don't know how much he would want to come in here and, redo everything. I think he would probably try to do something similar to what McCarthy did with Kellen Moore in the offense when he came in.
My only issue with Ron Rivera is it's been a long time since he's been like the primary play caller on defense. Jack Del Rio did it in Washington. He had, was it Sean McDermott running his defenses when he was in Carolina, and those Panthers teams were really good. So it would just be a little bit of a transition period, but I think he would figure it out pretty quickly. As for Joe Witt, I think he took the Washington job knowing that it's probably a more stable long-term outlook for him because if Mike McCarthy's on a 1-year deal, and let's say this year the Cowboys go, I don't know, 12-5 and lose in round 2 in the playoffs, McCarthy's probably not coming back, right? And that means that the whole coaching staff probably isn't coming back because you're going to go out and hire whoever, Ben Johnson, Mike Vrabel, Bill Belichick, and they're going to want their own guys. So for Witt, it probably made more sense to, hey, I'm going to Washington. I'm going to sign a new 4-year deal. This guarantees me, making it up, $10 million more. I understand why he did it. So now that we know Witt's not going to be the defensive coordinator of these 3 guys, and you can feel free to mention somebody else, but who do you want to be the defensive coordinator?
I mean, I think all the stars are aligning for Zimmer, it seems like, right? And it makes some sense. I mean, he's had a couple of years away. I think he has the highest ceiling of what we can get out of him. I do think that, it's almost like he's in the Goldilocks zone a little bit between these guys, right? Where he's not quite as different as Martindale, but he's more different enough that you feel like you're getting a marked maybe improvement, but at least a change, right? He's not quite as similar to Quinn as Rivera potentially could be. But that's also a good thing too, because you really don't want to just do the same thing necessarily as you did last year, which I mean would have been a downside to any of these internal hires, right? So I do think that I can be convinced that Zimmer is the guy that gives you the highest upside of these coaches, and I could probably even be convinced into saying, that this is a situation where Zimmer might be an improvement, like your source said, at the defensive coordinator position, depending on how he's developed as a coach over these last few years and how he's kind of learned and studied the game these last few years. So to me, I think Zimmer is the guy that if I had my druthers that I would probably choose.
There's no perfect defensive coordinator candidate out there. All of these guys have warts. All of them have strengths. I just think for what the Cowboys need right now, I think Zimmer best fills that need, right? And I think I do worry about their defense struggling like the first 12 weeks of the season. I've got no doubt that it's going to get better, especially the second half of the year, as long as they can stay relatively healthy. But I do think the upside is that he generally knows how to stop good offenses, and his style of defense does play well in the playoffs. Give me Mike Zimmer. That's as of right now, that's the guy I want.
Yeah, I think it makes some sense for sure. And the more we've kind of learned a lot about this situation, it does seem that Zimmer is not only the front runner choice, but the choice that probably makes the most sense to all of us.
And we should mention really quickly, he has experience with the Joneses. Obviously, he was here forever, right? He also has experience with Mike McCarthy. They coached in the same division for how many years against one another? That's a connection right there. I just think this one makes the most sense. I could see Zimmer coming in and having success pretty quickly for the Cowboys. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We post videos every single day over there. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosher, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.